Unit 7, Chapter 14, Greeks and Non-Greeks. Erich Gruen. Whatever else Greeks were, they were not barbarians, at least not by their own lights. After all, they spoke Greek. Others spoke in unintelligible tongues, thus sounding to Greek ears as so much bar bar bar. The term barbarian served to demarcate the Hellenic world from the non-Hellenic. It provided a useful device to establish the distinctiveness of Greek values and character. When the term first came into fashion remains obscure. Its usage was rare indeed prior to the 5th century BCE, when the invasion of Persia galvanized the Greeks to develop a sharper sense of their own collective identity. The initial connotation of barbarian may have been quite neutral and innocent, nothing more than gobbledygook speaker. But in the 5th and 4th centuries, it began to carry a lot of extra baggage. It might suggest cultural or intellectual inferiority, lack of refinement, various insensibilities, brutality, chicanery, and a tendency to embrace despotism rather than the rule of law. It was certainly better to be a Greek than a barbarian. A famous saying, ascribed both to Thales and to Socrates, gave thanks to the gods for 3 things: that I was born human, not an animal, a man, not a woman, and a Greek, not a barbarian. Whether either of these philosophers made such a statement, we cannot know. But the ascription appears in a Hellenistic text by the biographer Hermippos of Smyrna in the 3rd century BCE, and it earned an echo in rabbinic writings with, of course, a Jewish twist. A prayer of thanks to the Lord, who did not make me a slave, did not make me a woman, and did not make me a goy. Climate alone produced essential differences between Europeans and Asians. Some Greeks, at least, had convinced themselves of the fact. That notion appears in a late 5th century treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, attributed to Hippocrates. The uniformity of their seasons renders Asians soft and unwarlike, idle and prone to accept rule by despots. Violent changes of climate make Europeans tougher, braver, self-reliant, and less inclined to submit to monarchs. This idea gained sharper definition in Aristotle's Politics. He specifies the Greeks in particular as beneficiaries of the ideal geographical and climatic conditions. Other Europeans endure cold climates and may be hardy and tough, but they are stupid and incapable of governing themselves, let alone anyone else. Asians enjoy the warm weather and possess some intelligence, but they are enervated and lazy, readily enslaved by their rulers. Greeks hold the middle ground, both intelligent and spirited, thus a free people capable of governing all mankind. Aristotle indeed may have practiced what he preached. A report has it that he advised his pupil Alexander the Great to be a leader for the Greeks, but a master for the barbarians. Treat the former as friends and kinsmen, the latter as animals or plants. Alexander did not take the advice. Climate, nature, and ethnicity were not necessarily determinative. Socrates famously asserted that the name Greeks refers not to a race, but to a mindset, and that the designation belongs to those who share our culture rather than our nature. This implies that the Hellenic achievement was open to non-Greeks, but also that few would earn it. Socrates, writing in support of a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, kept the distinction sharp. The dichotomy, however, is much fuzzier than such statements, so often quoted, might suggest. One needs only to read Herodotus. To be sure, the word barbaros, or a form thereof, appears with great frequency in his text, but the vast majority of instances occur in the second half of his history, when he treats the Persian War and the contrast between combatants in critical ways. And this polarity barely, if at all, affects his ethnography. As is well, Herodotus shows an even-handedness, indeed occasionally great admiration for the traits, character, and accomplishments of non-Greek peoples, notably Egyptians, Persians, and Phoenicians, even Scythians, so much so that Plutarch later went so far as to label him a Philobarbaros. Of course, Plutarch here buys into the standard dichotomy. Herodotus, in fact, had a much more subtle and complex take on the interplay of Greeks and non-Greeks. Plato also questioned the simplistic division of Greeks and barbarians, pointing out the multitudinous differences among the latter. Greeks, as is clear, spoke with many voices. Even the great enemy of Hellas, the Persian regime, its ruler and its people, was viewed through diverse lenses. Xenophon wrote an encomiastic biography of Cyrus the Great, imaginary and fictitious, but all the more telling for that. The Persian monarch was selected as the image of the ideal ruler, and the Persian Empire as exemplary of admirable rule. For most Greeks, like Socrates, Persia had become identified with luxury, servility, and decadence, an inviting target for attack. But Heraclides Ponticus, a pupil of Plato, writing on the eve of the Hellenistic age, pronounced the Persians and Medes as the noblest and bravest of barbarians. The enjoyment of pleasure is the mark of a liberal spirit. Alexander the Great had a mandate for the conquest of the Persian Empire, but, as is well known, the conqueror displayed a growing affinity for the institutions, practices, and values of the conquered. That may have irritated some of his Macedonian officers and troubled a few of his Greek advisors, but it was not wholly out of tune with Hellenic attitudes. The Alexandrian polymath Eratosthenes in the 3rd century heaped praise on the king for that broad-minded attitude and for rejecting the crabbed advice of Aristotle. Eratosthenes took direct aim at those who would divide the world into Greeks and barbarians. If a division is to be made, men must be judged for their virtues and vices. There are plenty of admirable barbarians. Take Indians and Aryans, even Romans and Carthaginians, and plenty of bad Greeks. The polyphonic chorus predominates. How to interpret it? The idea that the Hellenistic age brought with it a wider tolerance for the outsider does not supply a satisfactory answer. As we have seen, diverse attitudes can be found, and not infrequently, in writers of the classical era. Even the snide, onomatopoetic explanation of the term barbaros, which was proffered by a Hellenistic writer, need not be accurate for its origins. It looks like a direct borrowing from the Babylonian word barbaru that carries the meaning of foreign, hence perhaps not a Greek invention. Certainly others than Greeks employed it with a pejorative connotation. The Egyptians applied the designation to anyone who did not speak their language, and the Greek/barbarian contrast still held in the Hellenistic period. Polybius employs it with regularity in regard to Gauls, Carthaginians, Spaniards, Parthians, and others, though rather more gingerly in regard to Romans. Strabo can couple Greeks and Romans as distinct from the rude barbarians, but he makes no secret of his firm conviction for Greek cultural superiority. The increased contacts among peoples in the Hellenistic world of the Mediterranean bred greater familiarity, but could still breed contempt. Non-Greek writers might compose their works in Greek, as did the Egyptian Manethon, the Babylonian Berosos, the Phoenician Sanchoniathon, the Jewish authors of the Septuagint, the Roman Fabius Pictor, and even King Artavasdes of Armenia. But Greeks did not employ the literary languages of the barbarian to their cost. So the passage of time and the expansion of Hellas may not have marked quite so dramatic a change in the perception of the foreigner as we sometimes think. On this score, the conquests of Alexander were less than a watershed. The prevailing impression is one of divergent and discordant, yet somehow interlocking and overlapping constructs of Greek and non-Greeks from both sides. And the constructs respected no chronological boundaries. How best to approach this interplay of mutual perceptions? One avenue in particular will be pursued here, the examination of inventive fictions that crossed ethnic and cultural divides. A selective sample of such fictions can illuminate this highly complex process. The Hellenic hero Perseus, slayer of the Gorgon and rescuer of Andromeda from the sea monster, supplies a striking instance. Alexander the Great claimed him as an ancestor, and so did Ptolemy. Linkage with a celebrated mythological figure from the Greek past had obvious advantages for Hellenistic rulers, but much more than that. Perseus carried multiple connotations that commingled Hellas with Egypt and Persia. The hero had Egyptian roots. He had been conceived by his mother Danae, an Argive princess, when Zeus penetrated her as a shower of gold. The royal house of Argos in Greek legend had strong migratory bonds with Egypt. A much earlier Argive princess, Io, another conquest of the ever-inventive Zeus, had found her way to Egypt either in the form of a white cow or as a kidnapped victim of the Phoenicians. Her descendant Danaos later returned to Argos with his 50 daughters, the Danaids, in flight from the 50 sons of Aegipotos, the subject of Aeschylus' suppliants, thus reviving their Argive lineage. From that lineage stemmed Danae and then Perseus. The latter's adventures brought him to Libya, where he captured the head of the Gorgon and then to the rescue of Andromeda, sometimes reckoned as a daughter of the Ethiopian royal house. More importantly, Perseus subsequently landed in Egypt itself at the city of Chemis, the site of his Egyptian heritage and the place where Egyptians still paid him homage through honorific festivals in Greek style at the time of Herodotus. The combination is noteworthy. Hellenic legends prompted the construct, but the Egyptians of Chemis evidently found it valuable to appropriate the Greek hero for their own traditions. And not Egyptians alone, Perseus could do triple duty. A version of the Perseus/Andromeda tale has Andromeda as daughter of the Persian Cepheus. When Andromeda produced a son, Perseus named him Perses, left him in Persia, and from him the Persians derived their name. Euripides apud Apollodorus. The origin of the story cannot be pinned down. As a Greek fable, it suggests the imposition of a Hellenic genealogy even on the most notorious enemy of Hellas. But it could as easily be a Persian initiative to incorporate Greek legend into their history. The amalgamation had benefits either way. When the Persian king Xerxes prepared his invasion of Greece, he sent an envoy to Argos seeking its neutrality, and he gave as reason the kinship between Argives and Persians that stemmed from Perses, the issue of Perseus and Andromeda. Herodotus himself does not vouch for the validity of the report, but it certainly circulated in his day. Both Argives and Persians were perfectly comfortable with it, and the idea that the house of Xerxes owed its origin to the shower of gold with which Zeus had impregnated Perseus' mother was accepted tradition in Athens. The triple mixture is quite arresting. Hellenic tradition embraced Perseus, among other things, tracing the Dorian kings back to that hero. At the same time, Greeks acknowledged that his mother Danae from the royal house of Argos had deeper roots in Egypt, thus making the Dorian chieftains ultimately Egyptians. No discomfort, it seems, troubled the purveyors of those genealogies. Some Persians, however, offered their own version. They were happy enough to accept Perseus as a forebear, but they questioned his Hellenic credentials. The hero on their reckoning was an Assyrian, who only later became Greek. But they had no hesitation in accepting the Hellenic tradition that the ancestors of Perseus' mother, Danae, were Egyptians. This remarkable genealogical stew eliminates the ancient propensity to multiply and entangle lineages that cross ethnic boundaries. The juggling of Perseus allowed Persians to link parts of their heritage to Mesopotamia and to Egypt, as well as to Greece. Egyptians could erect a shrine to him, perhaps as incarnation of one of their own deities. And all the information reaches us through stories recycled by the Greeks. Alexander's claim on Perseus as a forefather would have deep resonance in Iranian as well as Hellenic lands. And the Ptolemies' linkage to Perseus carried meaning for both Greeks and Egyptians. The binary opposition of Greek and non-Greek seems altogether absent. A multiplicity of legends link to the Colossus of Rome to the world of the Greeks. The story that prevailed in the age of Augustus attached Roman origins to the greatest of Hellenic myths, the Trojan War. Troy's celebrated hero Aeneas, a son of Aphrodite, escaped the fall of his city, migrated to the west, where his wanderings brought him to Italy and spawned a lineage whose members ultimately founded Rome itself. The canonical version, however, had numerous predecessors. A bewildering variety of inventive concoctions circulated in the Hellenistic world, many of them claiming Greek migrants as responsible for peopling Latium and even founding Rome. In diverse tales, Achaean settlers gained the credit as often as or more often than Trojan refugees. Odysseus and his descendants played a prominent role as wanderers par excellence. At least one strand of these bewildering traditions had Odysseus and Aeneas reach Italy together and collaborate in the founding of Rome. The tales derived largely from Greek imagination. Their thrust, as is plain, was not to distance Hellas from the barbarian, but to embrace, incorporate, and appropriate him. As a form of Hellenic cultural imperialism, this causes no surprise. But there is more to it than that. The very overlap of Greek and Trojan genealogies shows that cultural amalgam rather than disjunction prevailed. Moreover, the Roman engagement in the adaptation and refashioning of these legends suggest interchange and reciprocity, not a one-way street. The process can be illustrated by a particular but prominent element in the tradition, the affiliation of Rome with Arcadia. How far back this goes cannot be pinpointed, but a form of the story that took hold in the Hellenistic era set the connection many generations prior to the Trojan War itself. Romans derived, so it was alleged, from Aborigines claimed by some as an autochthonous people, but identified by others as migrants from Arcadia in the central Peloponnesos. Dionysios of Halicarnassos, who advocates the latter version, cites sources as early as the 5th century in support. Whether the identification is theirs or Dionysios' own interpretation, the association suited the fancy of Greek writers, like Dionysios, who insisted on the Hellenic character of Rome. That notion goes back at least to the 4th century BCE, when Heraclides Ponticus declared Rome simply a Greek city. Aborigines as Arcadians in the most remote past, however, were too fuzzy and had less than impressive pedigrees. The Arcadian roots, therefore, gained further elaboration by summoning a more attractive figure, the hero Evander, son of Hermes by an Arcadian nymph. Those were impressive credentials. The tale that took shape had Evander lead a number of Arcadians to Italy, where they planted a colony on an inviting hill near the Tiber, which they named Pallanteon, after their own hometown, a site later adopted by the Romans as the Palatine. If further confirmation for the link were needed, the ubiquitous Heracles were provided. Still another story brought Heracles, fresh from conquest in Spain, with a band of Greeks, including Arcadians, to a settlement on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. The Greek hero subsequently reinforced the Arcadian connection by marrying the daughter of Evander and generating offspring who would leave an Arcadian stamp on Rome. The legend finds echo in Polybius. He might pride himself on being a hard-headed, no-nonsense historian, but he also stemmed from Arcadia. It is hardly surprising that Polybius should find the legends of Evander at the origins of Rome irresistible. He endorsed the version that the Palatine took its name from Pallanteon, planted by the Arcadians, but he has it named after young Pallas, son of Heracles and grandson of Evander. The Hellenic features of Rome thus proliferated. Greek writers obviously found it satisfying to stress the Arcadian underpinnings of their Western power. And not Greeks alone. Roman intellectuals took up the tale with comparable relish. Fabius Pictor in the late 3rd century not only recorded the arrival of Heracles in Italy, but also credited Evander with bringing the alphabet, earlier taught to Greeks by Phoenicians, and thus giving double cultural authority to the Latin language. Fabius, of course, wrote in Greek, a noted Philhellene, but Cato the Elder himself, not normally identified with Hellenism, had no difficulty in taking a comparable line. He accepted the proposition that Aborigines in Italy, from whom the Romans descended, were in fact Greek, and he propagated, perhaps even expanded on, a tradition in which the Arcadians under Evander disseminated the Aeolic dialect among Italians, a tongue adopted by none other than Romulus himself. The reciprocal playing with legends augmented the ties that intertwined Greeks with the Romans. The process became the more entangled when Aeneas and the Trojans were brought into the mix. Trojan origins for Rome had become increasingly orthodox doctrine, at least among Romans, by the late Hellenistic period. That need not, however, preclude the Hellenic ingredient. Inventive ingenuity would see to it. A tradition emerged that traced Aeneas's roots to Greek itself, indeed to Arcadia. The tale claimed Atlas as first king of Arcadia in the distant mists of antiquity, with a glorious lineage to follow that embraced Zeus himself and his Arcadian son Dardanos. On this story, Dardanos led out an Arcadian expedition after floods had devastated his native land to settle in the Troad. Hence, Aeneas, the quintessential Trojan, was in fact of Arcadian heritage. Arcadian intellectuals welcomed and embellished the idea. Some had Aeneas settle in Arcadia after his departure from Troy and live out his days there. Others, however, combined the traditions and completed the circle. Aeneas, the Trojan of Arcadian heritage, moved from Troy to Arcadia and then to Italy, where he bore a son named Romulus. The Troy-Arcadia-Rome line thus gained full expression. Greek writers obviously filled out the fictions, but eminent Romans happily entered into them. The great scholar Varro gave his endorsement to the tale of Aeneas's Arcadian origins. The whole matrix of legends underscores a complicated but interdependent process. Greek authors spun diverse stories that set Roman success in the context of Hellenic traditions, and Romans appropriated those traditions to spin them to their own purposes. This was no linear development, but an intricate byplay in which the lines repeatedly crossed and turned back on themselves. The connections multiplied, and the Greek/non-Greek distinction dissolved. A different permutation offers an unusually fascinating insight into the process: mutual perceptions of Greeks and Jews. In this double loop, Jews are constructed as Greek philosophers, whereas Greek philosophers emerge as dependent on Jewish lore. The idea of otherness is decidedly submerged. A fragment of Theophrastus, pupil of Aristotle, characterizes Jews as a nation of philosophers who converse with one another about God, gaze at the stars and speculate about them, and summon the divinity through their prayers. Theophrastus plainly did not have solid testimony about the Jews. To turn them into astrologers is plainly off the mark, as are some of his other comments regarding the sacrifice of live animals and even human sacrifice. Theophrastus evidently provided an interpretatio Graeca. Jewish monotheism may have well prompted it. For the Greeks, those who speculate about a solitary divinity must be philosophers by nature. It is a fact of some note that this eminent thinker, not otherwise particularly enamored of Jews, about whom he was badly misinformed and whose sacrificial practices he contrasted with those of the Greeks, nevertheless reckoned them as a philosophic people. That categorization set them on a plane with other Eastern nations to whom the Greeks imputed an Oriental wisdom that generated respect. Theophrastus was not alone in this. A more remarkable narrative appears in the work of another Aristotelian pupil, Clearchus, from the Cyprian city of Soli, quoted his master, describing a chance encounter in Asia Minor between Aristotle and an unnamed Jew from Coele, Syria. The man mightily impressed Aristotle. He tested the Greek philosopher's knowledge and that of his pupils and other scholars, and as one who had lived in the company of many men of high cultivation, he imparted something more of his own. Aristotle discoursed in some detail about the Jew's marvelous steadfastness and restraint in his lifestyle. He observed indeed that this Jew was not only Greek in his language, but in his very soul. The interpretatio Graeca is here imposed as well. For Clearchus, the skills of the cultivated Jew came from his long acquaintance with the learned men of Hellas. The ability to hold his own in philosophical dialogue exhibited the Hellenic soul. But there is more to it than that. Clearchus cited Aristotle as identifying the Jewish people generally as descendants from the philosophers of India, men called Kalanoi by the Indians, but Jews by the Syrians. This complicates the heritage. Kalanoi, as such, do not exist. That is erroneous extrapolation from Kalanos, a celebrated Indian gymnosophist who sparred with Alexander the Great. But the association of Jews with Indian wise men is significant. Clearchus elsewhere claims that Indian gymnosophists descended from Persian Magoi, and others conjecture that Jews themselves descended from Magoi. These speculative fantasies, however remote from reality, carry meaning for the mentality of Greek intellectuals in the early Hellenistic period. Some of them at least reckon Jews as a philosophic people, perhaps as a sect of philosophers among the Syrians, just as the Magoi represented the philosophic elite of Persia. The combination of Eastern wisdom and Hellenic paideia gave the Jew whom Aristotle purportedly encountered his special and admirable qualities. This was no alien to be shunned. The notion of Jews as philosophers certainly went beyond the school of Aristotle. The erudite Megasthenes served as an envoy of Seleucus I at the court of the Indian ruler Chandragupta and lived in India for several years. He then composed, probably in the 290s, an extensive study of that land and its people, including the elevated caste of the Brahmins. A fragment of that work delivers the intriguing notice that everything that was said about nature by the ancients is also being said by those outside Greece who philosophize some of the views held by the Brahmins in India and some by the Jews in Syria. Here again, Jews are juxtaposed to Indian wise men, although not as their descendants, and their opinions associated with those of Greek philosophers. The Hellenic writer makes the conjunction and suggests the priority of Hellenic ideas, but he is content to have them shared by the sages of the East. Priority is a matter that Jews could be quite sensitive about, and they could also be quite clever about it. The peripatetic school of Aristotle conceived of Jews as philosophers of Eastern sagacity and Hellenic proclivity. One real Jewish philosopher, labeled indeed as a peripatetic, turned the conceptualization neatly on its head. Aristobulus, writing probably in the mid-2nd century BCE and possibly at the court of Ptolemy the Sixth Philometor, produced a lengthy exegetical commentary on the Torah, perhaps in dialogue form, displaying his exposure to various Greek philosophical traditions. Aristobulus, however, had other things in mind than acknowledging debt to Hellenic predecessors. Indeed, he did the reverse. The Jewish intellectual took pains to show that the Hebrew Bible prompted some of the best Greek philosophical thought. He claimed that the eminent Greek sage Pythagoras borrowed heavily from the books of Moses, framing his own precepts on the basis of Mosaic prescriptions. Socrates' fabled adherence to a divine voice simply followed in the path of Moses. Plato too examined Mosaic law in meticulous detail before composing his own treatises. Aristobulus' inventiveness on this score extended even to Hellenistic writers. He quoted lines of the Stoic poet Aratos of Soli, but substituted God for Zeus, thereby to show that his paean to the pantheistic divinity reflected Jewish ideas. Aristobulus went further still. He maintained that all philosophers concur in holding devotion to God as preeminent, a principle best enshrined in the law of the Torah. This breathtaking usurpation required some fancy footwork. How could Pythagoras, Socrates, or Plato have been acquainted with Mosaic precepts when they could not read Hebrew? Aristobulus dodged the bullet with further inventiveness. He simply postulated the existence of Greek translations, at least of various parts of the Hebrew Bible, long before the composition of the Septuagint. He had no qualms about compounding the fiction. It served the larger cause of making Moses responsible for the best in Greek philosophy. The creative Aristobulus heralded a long tradition of Jewish claims to the priority of their teachings and the indebtedness of Hellenic philosophers. The practice is reflected in the works of the great Jewish philosopher and exegete Philo of Alexandria. Philo traced the effects of Jewish learning back to Heraclitus. That early thinker took his cue from the teachings of Moses. As for the Platonic doctrine that the world is created but indestructible, Philo questions those who find its roots in Hesiod. It was there in the Pentateuch long before. Even Socrates' thoughts about God's fashioning of body parts that perform executory functions drew on Moses. And Hellenistic philosophy owes a comparable debt. Zeno's teachings that the wise must dominate the foolish come straight from Isaac's command that Esau serve his brother Jacob, and the Stoic doctrine that the wise man alone is ruler and king is nothing more than a reference to Abraham in Genesis. The Jews insisted on their own precedents. But the repeated, even if fanciful, connections between biblical pronouncements and Hellenic ideas demonstrates the urge to associate Jewish learning with Greek philosophy. It provides the other side of the coin in which Greek intellectuals interpreted the erudition of Jews as an adaptation of Hellenic wisdom. This was not tension, but reciprocity. The fact is strikingly illustrated by a Greek text that precedes chronologically any claim by Jews on the priority of the Bible to Greek philosophy. Hermippos of Smyrna, a biographer of Pythagoras, writing in the late 3rd century BCE, reported that the great sage was said to have adapted many of the laws of the Jews for his own philosophy, and that he, in fact, brought his teachings from the Jews to the Greeks. This is arresting testimony. The acknowledgement of Jewish priority in philosophic wisdom comes from a Greek, perhaps before any Jew had thought of the idea. The two cultures are enmeshed rather than detached. One final illustration brings the matter to full circle. Philo comments that the world contains multitudes of rich, eminent, and pleasure-seeking individuals, but very few who are wise, just, and virtuous. That latter small number, however, includes certain groups whom Philo specifies: the 7 sages of Greece, the Persian Magoi, the Gymnosophists of India, and the Essenes among the Jews. The Alexandrian Jew here echoes the constructs fashioned more than 3 centuries earlier by Greek thinkers like Megasthenes and Clearchus of Soli, the linkage of Hellenic philosophy to Jewish precepts and to Eastern wisdom. Contention over priority and precedence was common currency among Mediterranean peoples. Greeks had a passion for establishing their responsibility for the cultural contributions of other nations and vice versa. That much is well known. Less well known is the fact that Greeks had also had little difficulty in acknowledging the claims of others and building them into their own cultural personality. The Phoenicians represent a revealing instance. Hellenic attitudes toward that people diverged and splintered. One can find numerous snide comments about Phoenicians as crafty merchants, profiteers, and deceitful characters given to fraud and altogether untrustworthy. Yet, popular legend, widely disseminated among Greeks, had it that Cadmos, the Phoenician, was founder of the great city of Thebes. Or Thebes? Thebes. Some Greeks at least felt no qualms about associating their origins with the land of Lebanon, and Phoenicians themselves took the cue and exploited it. As a Hellenistic inscription from Sidon reveals, the city honored one of its own citizens for winning an athletic competition at the Nemean Games in Argos, and exclaims that Cadmean Thebes also rejoices in the victory of its mother city in Phoenicia. Cultural competition, however, offers an even more interesting angle. Philo of Byblos, a thoroughly Hellenized Phoenician writing in the early 2nd century CE, reflects it. Philo produced an erudite work on Phoenician history, culture, and religion, drawing on Sanchuniathon, a writer who allegedly lived before the Trojan War. The material transmitted by Philo, however, almost certainly stems from Hellenistic speculation, wrapping itself in the name of Sanchuniathon to give the aura of distant antiquity. Among other things, Philo made a point of asserting Phoenician priority in the invention and transmission of ancient tales regarding the origins of the gods and the universe. In particular, Philo preserves a Phoenician version of the Kronos legend that corresponds in part to the account in Hesiod's Theogony, but differs in most essentials, including the introduction of a euhemeristic analysis that the gods originate as men. And the learned Phoenician proceeds to assert that Hesiod and other Greek poets simply appropriated the tales from Phoenician writings and embellished, expanded, and Baudelarized them with gigantomachies, titanomachies, and castration fantasies of their own. Philo takes aim as well at Pherecydes, the 6th century Greek writer on the birth of the gods and the cosmos. In Philo's view, Pherecydes too got his information from Phoenician sources. The whole Hellenic concept of cosmogony is thus derivative. If there was a Greek response to these Phoenician claims, we don't have it. Hellenic writers prefer to cite Hesiod and let it go at that. What we do have, however, suggests that Greek intellectuals, or some of them at least, far from engaging in contentious rivalry with Phoenicia, could readily acknowledge Phoenician cultural precedents on certain fronts. A notable instance concerns the origins of atomic theory. Here too, Phoenicians had claimed one of their own as its father, a certain Mokos, also identified as dating to a time prior to the Trojan War, whose works were subsequently translated by the Hellenistic Phoenician writer Laitos. Such a claim could be expected. What is more remarkable is the retailing of that construct by the eminent Greek historian, philosopher, and scientific thinker Posidonios in the 1st century BCE. Posidonios did not refute or dispute it. He took the testimony of Mokos seriously. Although some might credit Democritus or Epicurus with first reckoning atoms as the basic units of matter, Posidonios awarded that distinction to the Phoenician Mokos of Sidon. The remarks of the learned Stoic philosopher open an important window on the mentality of the Hellenistic elite. Perhaps Posidonios was taken in by the ascription of Laidos's Greek translation to a Phoenician thinker who preceded the Trojan War. But the willingness of the Hellenic intellectual to accept the priority of Near Eastern wisdom on a critical item of scientific theory counts for a lot. He preferred to embrace the association with Phoenician learning rather than to trump it. A complicated relationship held between Greeks and Egyptians in Ptolemaic Egypt. The land had come under Greek authority after the arrival of Alexander the Great, whether as occupation or liberation, depending on one's perspective. Egyptians were sensitive about the matter, and the Ptolemies who ruled the nation had to address from the start the question of the legitimacy of a Greco-Macedonian ruling class in that land whose traditions long predated their own history. Both peoples struggled to work out the relationship to mutual satisfaction, or at least to represent it in a fashion that both would find palatable. That difficult and intricate process cannot be pursued here, but one absorbing tale allows entrance into the mental mechanism. The so-called Alexander romance constitutes a bewildering welter of folk tales, novelistic fiction, historical embellishments and distortions, and inventive concoctions shaped and reshaped over a period of centuries. It survives in 3 main recensions, the earliest of which was composed around 300 CEE, but utilizing material that must go back to the early Hellenistic period. The opening portion of the text holds particular interest. The tale centers on Nectanebos II, the last pharaoh of Egypt, ousted from power in 342 by a second Persian conquest of Egypt, driven to the south and ending in obscurity. But he looms large in legend. The Persian dynasty that succeeded him did not last long, defeated and removed forever by the invasion of Alexander. The image or construct of the last Egyptian ruler took on particular importance in the decades after establishment of Ptolemaic authority. Egyptian national consciousness and the legitimacy of the new order were both at stake. In this milieu, the saga of Nectanebos in the Alexander romance took shape. A resume of the narrative or its relevant parts is in order. The author introduces Nectanebos not only as the last pharaoh, but as a man especially skilled in the magical arts. Through reasoning power, he could bring all the elements of the universe to do his bidding. If war threatened, he did not battle with arms, weaponry, or military machines. He simply defeated enemies on land and sea with incantations. Model ships and soldiers floated in a cauldron and appealed to the god Ammon. This worked like a charm for a long time, but when one massive invasion took place, the cauldron delivered some alarming news. Egyptian gods were piloting the little wax boats of the enemy. Nectanebos got the message. He put on disguise, gathered what treasure he could stuff into his clothes, and fled the country. After wandering through a number of nations, he landed in Pella, seat of the Macedonian monarchy, the ruling capital of Philip II. There, the resourceful Nectanebos presented himself as an Egyptian seer and astrologer. The Egyptians themselves, bereft of their king after his mysterious vanishing act, sought guidance from the ancestor of the gods, who sent a reassuring oracle. The prediction affirmed that the monarch may have fled as an old man, but would return to Egypt as a youth and subject the enemies of his countrymen. No one quite grasped the significance of the oracle at that time, but the Egyptians ordered it inscribed on the Nectanebos' statue, hoping that someday it might be fulfilled. Nectanebos soon made quite a reputation in Macedon as an eminent seer, a reputation that reached the ears of the alluring queen Olympias, who summoned him to the palace. Her husband Philip was conveniently away at war, as was his wont. Nectanebos took full advantage, flattering the queen and boasting of his skills as dream interpreter, caster of horoscopes, and master of the magical arts. He then prophesied a future separation from Philip, who would marry another but offered a far better compensation. Olympias would sleep with a god, none other than the Libyan ram-headed deity Ammon, with whom she would conceive a son, a future avenger of Philip's misdeeds. Nectanebos had hatched a dastardly erotic scheme, alluring Olympias to the fact that she would first dream of intercourse with the god, and would subsequently experience it. He exerted all his magical powers to induce precisely the right dream, thus persuading the queen of his prophetic gifts. Nectanebos now had Olympias where he wanted her. He forecast that the god would appear to her in the guise of a serpent, then in Ammon's own form, followed by that of Heracles and of Dionysos in turn, and finally taking the shape of Nectanebos himself. Olympias eagerly welcomed the prediction, proclaimed that if the forecast was fulfilled, she would announce him as father of the child, and duly submitted herself to the mantic cloaked as multiple divinity. The queen rapidly became pregnant, her womb housing a child whom Nectanebos presciently prophesied to be invincible and dominant. There was, of course, still the problem of Philip. He returned to Macedon to discover a pregnant wife, whom he had obviously not impregnated. But Nectanebos' mantic powers managed to persuade the king that Olympias had been visited by a deity, no mere human adulterer. Philip was readily gulled. Olympias appropriately delivered a child amid lightning flashes, rolling thunder, and earthquakes. None could doubt that the father must have been divine. The boy, Alexander, who bore no resemblance to Philip or Olympias, had a great future in store. Young Alexander assimilated the martial prowess and fierce ambition of Philip, his early years consumed in rivalry with the king. Nectanebos continued to hang about the court, evidently enjoying the frequent absences of Philip. Alexander probed the prophetic powers of the seer and sought to benefit from his astrological knowledge. But in a stunning turnabout, the impetuous prince hurled Nectanebos against a rock, smashing his head and exclaiming that he had no business investigating the mysteries of heaven when he could not command the earthly realm. The dying Nectanebos then revealed to Alexander that he was his own father, the consequence of his devious deception of Olympias. Alexander then felt both remorse and betrayal. He regretted the murder of his father, but blamed him for never disclosing the deed until the end. Alexander informed his mother, and a proper burial followed. When the all-conquering Alexander eventually reached Egypt, the prognostications came to fruition. Priests and prophets hailed him as a new pharaoh, his enthronement occurring in the ancient seat of Memphis. And Alexander noticed the statue of Nectanebos with its inscription that forecast the return of the king, not as an elderly monarch, but as a young man who would subdue the dreaded Persians. Alexander immediately embraced the statue, publicly proclaimed Nectanebos as his own father, and declared the fulfillment of the oracle. Such is the gist of the tale. How to interpret it? Egyptian conceptualization must lie at its core. The element of divine fatherhood for the ruler of the land holds a central place in the legend. This can hardly be anything but an allusion to the standard myth of Amon-Ra as fathering the pharaoh through a nocturnal visit to the queen in the guise of her husband. Nectanebos' choice of divinity is hardly accidental. The attachment of this lofty lineage to Alexander brought the Macedonian king into line with Egyptian tradition. The attachment of this lofty lineage to Alexander brought the Macedonian king into line with Egyptian tradition, thus asserting critical continuity between pharaonic rule and Greco-Macedonian overlordship. The Egyptian element in this construct is fundamental. In this fashion, the Egyptians could claim the accomplishments of Alexander for themselves. The overthrow of the Persian Empire and the occupation of Egypt, therefore, came not at the hands of an alien conqueror, but through the son of Pharaoh and under the aegis of Ammon. It would not be the first time that such a connection was concocted to camouflage the succumbing of Egypt to external power. A closely comparable story had assuaged the sensitivities of Egyptians after conquest of the land by the Persian king Cambyses in the 6th century. They transformed Cambyses into the son of Cyrus and an Egyptian princess, thus laying claim on the heritage of Cyrus the Great. The parallel is nearly precise. This represents more than the ascription of divine sonship to Alexander. It constitutes Egyptian expropriation of the Macedonian achievement to their own purposes. It would be a mistake to see this as nationalist propaganda with an anti-Macedonian bent. The contrary holds. The thrust of the Egyptian construct was to subsume and transform the Hellenic overlord, not to reject or undermine him. Egyptian appropriation of celebrated Greek figures possessed a solid history. Reports had it that the most eminent of Greeks, like Orpheus, Homer, Pythagoras, Solon, and Plato, all gained their learning from visits to Egypt. Alexander fits suitably in that company. But that is not the whole story. This narrative had undergone more than one transmutation before attaining the form in which it has reached us. The Greek text has a strongly Greek flavor. A reworking at Hellenic hands needs to be taken into account. Sardonic and satirical elements inhere in the yarn. Of course, such elements were not foreign to Egyptian writings, even occasionally in mockery of their own rulers. But an intriguing ambiguity, suggesting a give and take representation, characterizes the text and accords it a special quality. Nectanebos appears as a hero of the story, according to Alexander, an Egyptian lineage. Yet the hero is flawed and suspect. Nectanebos is certainly no warrior. He wins his battles with toy ships and necromancy. When a serious enemy appears on the horizon, he collects his goods, dons disguise, and flees for his life. His seduction of Olympia succeeds through trickery and skullduggery. Nor is Olympia a mere passive instrument in the fugitive Egyptian's lecherous scheme. She summoned him to the court in the first place. In a subtle touch, unnoticed by critics, the text hints that she knew precisely what was happening. When told that a succession of gods would arrive in her bedroom, Olympias responded to her would-be seducer by saying that once a child was born, she would proclaim him the son of Nectanebos. One might well wonder whether the queen was manipulating the situation to have her own back at Philip. Nectanebos, in any case, hardly cuts an admirable figure. He comes to an early death in ridiculous fashion by being tossed on a jutting rock by the youthful Alexander. And it is noteworthy that Alexander, once he learns that Nectanebos is indeed his father, blames him for sealing his own fate by neglecting to mention that salient fact. Alexander takes full advantage of the situation when he encounters the inscribed oracle in Memphis, laying claim to pharaonic heritage and accepting the forecast of conquering Persia as avenger of Egypt. But as the narrative makes clear, Alexander had inherited the qualities of Philip, not of Nectanebos. The text, however, no more presents an anti-Egyptian message than an anti-Macedonian one. Olympias may have collaborated with or even engineered the scheme of Nectanebos. But the fugitive king managed to provide the Egyptian lineage that enabled his countrymen to associate themselves with the conqueror rather than the conquered. Alexander had eclipsed and even eliminated his flawed father, but he accepted the Egyptian connection and made it the rallying cry of his campaign against Persia. How much of this narrative stems from Egyptian and how much from Greek reflection cannot be known. The date of composition remains elusive, and a quest for it is probably unhelpful. Nor does it much matter. In a text reworked many times, the strands naturally intertwine, and any specific date, even could it be known, could carry little meaning for the complex composition. One may presume that the narrative arose in the circumstances of Ptolemaic Egypt in its initial form, probably relatively early in the history of that regime. The Egyptians had reason to seek a reassuring accommodation to Hellenic rule, and the Ptolemies had reason to seek legitimacy in Egyptian eyes for their own usurpation. More than one constituency benefited from this elaborate tale. An aspect of high significance, however, needs emphasis. Neither Greeks nor Egyptians relegated the other to the status of barbarian. On the contrary, each found cause for associating themselves with the achievements or traditions of the other. Numerous comparable instances could be cited. The tangled tales carry a resounding message. Some were clearly concoctions by intellectuals, like the reports of Jews as philosophers and Greeks as students of the Bible, or the links of Rome to Arcadia, or the jumbled genealogy of Perseus, but most steeped into the public consciousness, well beyond the level of the elite. Cults to the Perseus in Egypt, the embrace of Greek/Trojan legends as part of Roman tradition, and the fanciful fable of Nectanebos reveal a resonance in various parts and among various peoples of the Hellenistic world, and they all betoken an openness to hybrid cultural identities in that world. The roots of Hellenic heroes could be found in Persia or Egypt, Arcadians appear at the origins of Rome. Greeks borrow from the learning of Jews and Phoenicians, and Hellenistic rule in Alexandria stem from forebears with the mingled blood of Macedonian and Egyptian royalty. Fertile imaginations invented these fictions, but they exposed a mentality that resisted the estrangement of the alien and preferred to blur the boundaries between Greek and non-Greek.